What's up, everybody? It's Lo, Beauty Demon back, and I am here with another Get Ready With Me true crime story. I know I haven't filmed one of these in a while. I've been trying some other stuff out on my channel, doing some live streams where I've been diving into beauty businesses that I'm interested in, or just talking about like drama that I've been seeing around. I've also been experimenting with YouTube Shorts, which if you're like, what the fuck is a YouTube Short? Basically, YouTube is trying to compete with TikTok and Instagram Reels, and they're rolling this whole thing out. So I've been kind of playing around, having some fun with that. Check them out if you haven't already. And now, let's get into today's true crime story. First, before we get into this, warning, things that we're going to be talking about are sensitive in nature, sensitive true crime things. I'm not going to get too into like bloody stuff, but we are going to be talking about some sensitive topics. Today's topic we're going to be talking about is the Benoit murder-suicide, and this is focusing heavily on Chris Benoit, the WWE wrestler, and the murder-suicide of him and his wife, Nancy, and their child, Daniel. But I'm gonna rewind a lot. I want to start back at the beginning and kind of give a little bit of backstory to how they got to the point that they were, and not just focus on the horrific scene that happened there. Now, I do also want to put out a little bit of like a warning, because I do talk about Chris Benoit sometimes in a positive light, and I don't want anybody to think that I am doing this because I think he was like an amazing person. He was a fantastic wrestler, and I will share this later on towards the end to kind of like my thoughts overall on how he should be remembered in the WWE following that. But I don't want anybody to take this as I'm overlooking the events that we're going to be talking about at the end of his life. And now let's get into this. Christopher Michael Benoit, he was born in Montreal, Quebec on May 21st, 1967. He does have a sister, and at some point they moved to Edmond, Canada. This is all Canada, by the way. If you don't know where any of these places are, they're all Canada. I kind of take for granted the fact that I live so close to Canada. For some reason, Canada always has like really good wrestlers coming out of it. I don't know. Chris's father said at the age of 12, Chris became obsessed with wrestling. They went to a local wrestling show and he saw the Dynamite Kid wrestle Bret the Hitman Hart. Side note, if you didn't know this, Bret the Hitman Hart is where half of Bretman Rock's name comes from, the other being from The Rock. Fun little weird fact about that. It was the Dynamite Kid who made the diving headbutt a really popular move, and this was a move that Chris would adapt later in his wrestling career. It's now very widely considered a very unsafe move, and a lot of companies don't really like to let wrestlers do it anymore. And even since Chris Benoit, some wrestlers who do the move actually report having serious head trauma later. Even wrestlers as recent as somebody like Daniel Bryan, who had a very similar wrestling style to Chris Benoit, mostly I think because both they had very small muscular stature, which is not usually something that is common in the wrestling world. Most people like big beefy wrestler guys. So Chris was totally focused on becoming a wrestler, and his dad even bought him a weight set. So then at 15 he actually got to meet the Dynamite Kid, Tom Billington, and he kind of like flexed for him and was like, I want to be just like you. So they kind of took an interest in him, and begging, Chris's father, Thomas, allowed him to go to the Hart Dungeon in Calgary, which was a good 3 hours away from them, and begin training as a wrestler. In the wrestling community, the Hart Dungeon is very respected. Lots of really big name wrestlers came from there, including the entire Hart family, and they're considered a dynasty in the world of wrestling. Very, very well respected. Chris began training under Bruce Hart, but then eventually the whole patriarch of the family, Stu Hart, took over as he saw that Chris had it in him to go all the way. So Chris graduated in 1985, and his first official wrestling match was also in 1985. He began wrestling with Stampede Wrestling, which is owned by, Stu Hart, so it's pretty easy to transition into that company if you already know who owns the place. Chris wrestled with Stampede Wrestling for 4 years, and he took on the name Dynamite, cute, Chris Benoit. So Dynamite Chris Benoit is kind of like a little little bit of an homage to the Dynamite Kid as well, since that was pretty much the reason he wanted to get into wrestling in the first place. In paying homage, of course, he would do the flying headbutt. He also would do another signature Dynamite Kid move, which is the snap suplex, which is a really cool move, and I do like watching it, and it is one of my favorite moves to watch. Coincidentally, one of my other favorite moves is the sharpshooter, which is like a finishing lock, and it's known very widely as being a Hart family move. Specifically, Bret Hart used it a lot, and Chris Benoit would use it later on in his career as a finishing move too. If I was a wrestler, that would probably be my finishing move. I would totally go for that. In 1988, Chris married his first wife, Martina, and they had 2 kids, a daughter named Megan and a son named David. And David looks exactly like Chris Benoit. They look so alike. Even recently, David has been training in wrestling and trying to get into the indie circuit. Well, I mean, before the pandemic, you know, he was doing that. So other than those few couple facts, I really couldn't find a lot about his first marriage. I'm sure I could have found more information if I actually read a book about the situation, but you guys, I'm sorry, I just didn't have time to read an entire book. That being said though, I mean, I did go through a lot of old school articles, had to use the Wayback Machine, but even like going through all that stuff, I really couldn't find much of anything about it. We're just gonna move on and talk about his wrestling career a little bit. In 1989, Stampede Wrestling shut its doors, and Chris was lucky enough to get signed to a wrestling promotion in Japan called New Japan Pro Wrestling. So New Japan is like the premier wrestling promotion in Japan. When he moved over there, he had to go through the New Japan dojo. Now, just because it's wrestling doesn't mean that they don't treat it like any other kind of martial art. When you start at New Japan, you have to go through the dojo just like everybody else. You have to train, hone your skills, and to do basic things like cleaning. They make you sweep and do laundry and do other things to show respect to the elders that you're working with. I think it's kind of cool because honestly, it teaches a lot of wrestlers to be humble, and sometimes when they're coming from other places, they are not so humble. You can think of a couple. In his debut in New Japan, he debuted with a mask. He was a masked wrestler, and his name was Pegasus Kid, so kind of like Dynamite Kid, but then made a little Pegasus. In the 80s and stuff, it was all about like animals because people were like really scary in the ring. He went by Pegasus Kid. Eventually, he changed it to Wild Pegasus, and he became pretty popular. Now, New Japan does do like a promotion. They like cross promote with other wrestling leagues around the world, so he would also have the opportunity to go to places like Mexico, in America with some divisions as well, and he would do things like with ECW and stuff like that. It was during his time here though that he met his best friend Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero went on to become a very well respected and highly decorated wrestler. Everybody loves Eddie Guerrero, honestly. Like, I didn't like him when I was a kid, but I like him now. He was a good guy. And they became really good. Well, actually, they hated each other at first, but then they became really good friends, and their families became very close as well. In New Japan, he was pretty popular. Even won the Junior Heavyweight Championship, which I think technically it's called the IWGP because it's like the International Wrestling, I don't know. But he was big. He was popular there. People loved him. And he was well respected inside and outside of the ring. People saw him as a workhorse, and he was very determined to be the best at what he could do. He always wanted to make sure every match was 100% believable, and if he felt like he fucked something up, he would actually punish himself for his fuck ups himself. Not even anybody telling him that he fucked up, he would just punish himself. Like that's a self-loathing motherfucker if I ever heard one. Because he had that little, crossover with New Japan, he was able to, work with WCW. Now, if you know anything about wrestling, WCW became the main competition for WWE in the late 90s, very early 2000. But this is like 1992, they were not where they would be yet. Right now, they were still heavily influenced by Ted Turner and what he wanted. So they were trying to make a transition from being some kind of like country southern bumpkin-y kind of wrestling to what we think of when we think of WCW. But through traveling to different countries and wrestling, he became known as an amazing technical wrestler. And this whole brutish persona that he created created of this like stone cold guy who is just no nonsense coming into the ring. The Chris Benoit we would see on screen, that is kind of, it just became more and more apparent and known. So the WCW thing ended pretty, it wasn't very long. And in off season from New Japan, he was able to work with ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling. ECW was known for some crazy shit. Like they made like chair shots popular, jumping off of balconies through tables. I think even at one point in ECW, all the fans took their folding chairs and threw them out into the ring. It was kind of crazy. So the extreme like barbed wire chain matches, that shit came from ECW. And it was here that Chris Benoit really began to shine because he had this cold, calculating, like menacing. I mean, honestly, I'd be fucking terrified to get into a ring with Chris Benoit. It gives you that like scary smile and he's like missing a tooth, like, whoa. At the ECW pay-per-view event, November to Remember in 1994, Chris accidentally broke the neck of his opponent, Sabu. He broke down when he hit the locker room. He was very upset. He thought he paralyzed Sabu. Just to make sure you all know, Sabu is totally fine. I've actually seen this guy wrestle even like 5-6 years ago, which at this point I was like, dude, this guy is so old, he should probably retire. Because honestly, he was kind of already old when Chris Benoit was wrestling him. And it was because of this, ECW promoter Paul Heyman gave him the nickname the Crippler. And he would even later become the Canadian Crippler. I'm not really sure if he liked that nickname, but it stuck. And it kind of just fed into that whole cold and calculating persona. Unfortunately, the time with ECW was cut short because honestly, it was just Paul Heyman couldn't get his shit together and he didn't renew his visa in time for him to stay. Because remember, he's Canadian, Chris Benoit's Canadian, and then he was working in America and, he's got to get his work visa moving. So it was back to Japan for him. And when he got back, he started to impress people more and more. He actually wrestled Chris Jericho, who is one of my favorite wrestlers, and really started to impress the people over at WCW. WCW did have a working relationship with New Japan, so they decided to start transitioning him over into their programming. This is like 1995, 1996, so now WCW is starting to get on that trajectory of going after the ratings of WWE, or at the time WWF, and we're starting to get into what is referred to affectionately or not so affectionately as the Monday Night Wars. So now he's in the big leagues. He's working with people like Ric Flair, Brian Pillman, who is kind of a terrifying person, Arn Anderson, all these big wrestlers that were huge in WCW, and some of them were even big in WWE and then like transitioned over to WCW. It was also in 1997 that Chris divorced his first wife, Martina, and then he moved in with a woman named Nancy. And this is where our story is really starting to pick up. So who was Nancy? So Nancy was born Nancy Toffoloni. She was born in somewhere in Florida. I'm assuming like the Miami area. She graduated from high school then, and she married right out of high school. She worked as like a part-time model, and she answered phones at Allstate. And her first husband, Jim Doss, he was a wrestling fan, so he would take her to wrestling shows all the time, and she actually started to like wrestling too. She, like I said, was an amateur model, so sometimes they would ask her to promote shows. She actually got tapped to do a cover shoot for a wrestling magazine, and it was there that she met a wrestler named Kevin Sullivan, and she kind of began an affair with Kevin Sullivan because she was like doing promoting and stuff like that and was starting to appear in wrestling magazines. She had to create a character, so she created this character named Fallen Angel, and she was like this like gothic, dark, mysterious lady, and it fit right in with what Kevin Sullivan was already doing in his stable, which was basically they were pretending to be a bunch of Satanists, but I mean they weren't really Satanists, they were just pretending, It's important to note that Nancy was not actually a wrestler. She was what is called a valet, or like a manager. A lot of people just look at valets and managers as like sexy women that just accompany guys to the ring and they just look sexy. But valets do way more than that. A lot of times they're very integral to the storyline. They help move the story along. They can also work on really getting an audience hyped up if it's starting to get really quiet. Because let's be honest, wrestlers are performers. First and foremost, they're just doing very athletic performances. There's nothing worse than if you're wrestling or doing any kind of performance where you want people to be excited and cheer and there's like nothing. So she was really good at her job. She was great at hyping up the audience. She helped move storylines along, and people really believed the character of the fallen angel. So not only did she work with Kevin Sullivan, she ended up marrying Kevin Sullivan. She divorced her first husband, Jim, and married Kevin Sullivan, and they became an actual wrestling power couple. They would travel around all over to different independent shows. In 1989, Kevin and Nancy started making appearances in WCW. Nancy first appeared as an audience member named Robin Green. She would always start stuff with another wrestler named Scott Steiner, who is called the Genetic Freak, and I think he's banned from WWE now. Eventually, it came out, like, oh, she's on Kevin Sullivan's side, and it just became part of the whole storyline. That's what valets do. They help move the story along. And they worked in the WCW for a short amount of time. In 1993, however, they made the move over to ECW. In WCW, she had kind of adopted the moniker of Woman, and that was her, wrestling name until she ended up leaving the business. She was Woman. Now, Kevin didn't stay in ECW very long. He kind of ventured back to WCW, but Nancy stayed in ECW for a while and would manage other wrestlers like Tommy Dreamer, Sandman, stuff like that. But in 1996, she did go back to ECW and worked with her husband again. I can't imagine working with your husband, but when you're when you're an actor like that, I guess it makes sense. So in 96, when she joined her husband back at ECW, that's where the real story of Chris and Nancy begins. Kevin Sullivan was not just a wrestler, but he was also a promoter and a booker. And bookers kind of essentially help write the stories and figure out who's going to be best in what role, and kind of pick and choose who's going to go into what. So he had this ongoing feud with his stable against Chris Benoit and their stable, which if a stable, I use a lot of wrestling lingo and jargon in this, I'm really sorry. A stable is just a group of people that have a common goal, and it's usually some sort of theme. Kevin's was, they were Satanists, and Chris's, I don't know, she was just they're big bad guys, and he was always kind of the muscle or something, if you will. So part of the storyline that was booked was that Nancy would leave Chris for Nick. To make it believable is they would have them photographed out in public, holding hands. They would make out. They would be in hotel rooms together. They would have moments where it would look like they were being intimate and things like that. And then over a period of time, it stopped becoming acting and it started becoming real for them. And they started to really get feelings for one another. The running joke in the industry was that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce, which is true, but also really sad. Kevin and Chris had a really big match at, I think it was the Bash at the Beach, which is a really big pay-per-view event for WCW. And it was going to be a retirement match for Kevin Sullivan. It was going to be a way for him to transition from being on screen to being more of the producer and booker. So it was a I retire match. The match went from being something that any kind of wrestling match would be to being a real full-out brawl. And apparently Chris Benoit even broke Kevin Sullivan's eardrum in it. Now, of course, some people are well, they're all brawls, right? Some people think wrestling is fake too. And I just want to put it out there that wrestling is kind of fake in the sense that the outcome of the match is predetermined. Usually both people that are going into the ring know who's going to be winning the match. Anything that happens from the time that bell rings to the time the match is done and we have our winner is not necessarily planned. Sometimes, yeah, it's helpful if wrestlers can get in the ring with each other and practice some of their big moves or big spots that they want to do, but that doesn't really get to happen very much because they're on the road a lot. Some wrestlers do also have the luxury of having trained with their opponents or having gone against their opponents a lot, so they understand how they move in the ring and how to communicate with them effectively. But when people say wrestling is fake, I can't completely agree, but I can't completely disagree because, yeah, the outcome is predetermined, performance, so in that sense that it's fake, but everything else that's happening is, for the most part, real. Sometimes they pull punches and pull kicks, but people still get hurt. And if you've ever done martial arts or stage fighting, which I've done both, it can still hurt. You just have to learn how to take certain hits so it doesn't cause serious long-term damage. But in these instances, it still can. Pain is very inevitable. And all wrestlers that go into this, they kind of already know this is a very serious thing that could happen to me. This could really happen. May 26, 1997, Woman made her last wrestling appearance. She was basically retiring. Nancy and Chris had moved in together. They were ready to start their lives, free from their previous partners. So she was more focused on becoming the stay-at-home wife, being there for her husband, but she wanted to build their life together and stay home and support Chris because this was really his passion. This is what he's wanted to do his entire life. So she moved to their home and just started to help manage his career outside of the ring from home. And then in 2000, Kevin Sullivan became the head booker at WCW, and it upset a lot of people, especially Chris Benoit, because he already had a personal beef with Kevin Sullivan, so he definitely thought it meant, this is going to be the end of my career here. Now, in 2000 is when the Monday Night Wars were like really at an all-time peak. Now, the Monday Night Wars was when WCW and WWE both had Monday shows, and they were at the same time. So they were competing for the same ratings. It would be a big deal if a wrestler hopped from one promotion to another. Well, with Kevin Sullivan being in charge of booking and promoting, it upset a lot of people, including Chris. So they decided they were going to move. So Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko literally just showed up at Monday Night Raw and were in the audience. And then they were signed that night. Everybody was losing their shit to see three of the biggest people over from WCW just show up. And then I think they ended up getting in the ring against the Road Dogs. I think that was their name, from DX. And it's been quite a while. They pretty much annihilated them and people loved it. A month after he moved over to WWE, Nancy gave birth to their child, Daniel. He was a cute little boy, but he was tiny, which really wasn't that surprising because also Chris was a really small guy. Remember, he was considered tiny by WWE standards. Nancy worked really hard to create a good life for Daniel and Chris when he was home because, you know, he's on the road all the time. But he was getting huge pushes. He was winning multiple championships. He was United States Championship. He had gotten the Intercontinental Championship. He was constantly being pushed in big storylines against some of the biggest wrestlers WWE had. He was very well respected, very liked, and had a lot of fans. Life at home was great. His son Daniel even said in the documentary on Vice called The Dark Side of the Ring that step wasn't a word that they used in their household. Nancy didn't think of David as her stepson. He was just another one of her kids that she was there to love and take care of along with Daniel and their sister Megan. In 2001, Chris actually got a neck injury that required surgery. And this isn't necessarily uncommon in the wrestling world to get neck injuries, especially when you're doing, I don't know, diving headbutts. Unfortunately, in this time, injuries were not always treated as, you know, as serious as they should be. Because a lot of wrestlers at the time, they didn't want to take the time off. You take the time off, you're not on the screen as much, you're not as well known. Sometimes people forget about you. But he did take the time that he needed, and he was able to recover. Sometimes wrestlers end up abusing drugs during this time because they're just trying to cope with the pain. So I'm not going to speculate as to whether that was happening or not with him because I'm not actually sure, but it was pretty common. And I know his friend Eddie Guerrero did actually deal with a major drug addiction at the time too, and for a while was let go from the WWE because of his problems, and then was, after he got treatment and got help and got better managing his disease, he was able to come back and was so beloved. Everybody was so happy, especially Chris Benoit, to be reunited with his friend again. You know, they were best friends. So in 2004, he actually won the Royal Rumble, which is one of my favorite WWE pay-per-view events. Royal Rumble is a 30-man match where it starts off with two guys and then like every 5 minutes, like another man enters until there's 30 total participants. If you get thrown over the top rope of the ring and your feet hit the floor on the other side, then you are eliminated. Last man standing is the winner of the Royal Rumble, and then they get title spot at the biggest pay-per-view event of the year, which is WrestleMania. And WrestleMania is usually like 3 months after the Royal Rumble. So it is a huge deal that he was the Royal Rumble winner. This was putting him on a trajectory to be the World Heavyweight Champion of WWE. And then that following March 14th, why does everything always happen on March 14th? Because I've had like a few true crime videos where people get killed on March 14th, or their birthdays on March 14th, or their wedding anniversaries on March 14th. If anybody is into astrology and planetary alignment, tell me what the significance of March 14th is. I need to know at this point. It's too much of a coincidence. But on March 14th, he won the championship. He won at WrestleMania against Triple H. It was, I think, one of the first times somebody had used a submission move to win at WrestleMania. He used his crossface crippler, and when he won, it was a big deal. It was huge. There were streamers falling from the roof. Eddie Guerrero came out and, congratulated his friend, and it was something that everybody thought Chris deserved. He had worked really hard for the company. He worked really hard to get to where he was. And then on November 13th, 2005, Eddie Guerrero was found in his hotel room by his nephew, Chavo Guevara, and a WWE security official. They were at this hotel because they were going to be doing an event that night. And they were traveling with Chris because the three of them were, they were best friends. They were like family, really. Chris calls Chavo and he says, "Hey, where are you guys? I'm downstairs. Are you guys coming down?" While he's in the hotel lobby, Chavo tells Chris Benoit that Eddie's passed away, and Chris loses it. Chavo said he'd never heard any kind of emotion like that come from Chris Benoit. Obviously, he took it really personally. In honor of Eddie, the WWE had a 12-bell salute, which they do whenever they lose somebody that's, very important to them in the company. They also invited some of the other wrestlers to pay their respects in a video message to Eddie. And Chris, of course, was one of them. In this footage, he breaks down. And Eddie was, like I said, his best friend, his brother. And he cried so much during this that he actually abruptly ended it and walks away because he's breaking down. This footage is really heartbreaking for me to watch. And the other thing that broke my heart about this footage is after the tragedy that we're going to be discussing later, a lot of news media outlets would use clips from this or footage from this and have it playing in the background. I just felt like that was dirty. This stuff happened a few years earlier, and he was expressing extreme heartbreak over somebody that he loved just as much as everyone else in his own family. And it's just really hard. He had a really hard time moving on from this. Eddie Guerrero's wife, Vicky, she was an employee of WWE as well. She was having a really hard time grieving. Her and Chris grieved together a lot. Nancy actually moved in to the Guerrero home to help take care of Vicky for a month and the kids to help support them. And when Chris wasn't on the road, he would be back at the Guerrero home as well. Vicky said she would find him sometimes on Eddie's side of the bed, crying in the gym. He had a really hard time moving past it, and he became more emotional and sometimes even aggressive. Vicky said it was really Nancy that helped her, I don't want to say get over Eddie's death, because I'm sure she's never completely gotten over Eddie's death, but she was the person that made her get the strength to move on and to start taking care of her family again. And I think that just speaks volumes to Nancy's character and how strong she was and how she took over for every person, because it wasn't just her immediate family, it was also her extended family of the Guerreros that she knew she had to step in and help. A lot of wrestlers, even at the time, said they were very shocked by the amount of emotion that Chris showed initially, like at Eddie's funeral, but then afterwards he became very closed off. And you didn't really see him like backstage with other wrestlers, like shooting the shit, stuff like that anymore. It was also reported that he became more increasingly paranoid about people knowing where he lived, knowing how he got to work, knowing where his hotels were. I think a lot of paranoia began to really set in for Chris. It also has to be hard for him because like the WWE they travel to the same cities year after year, and they go to the same arenas year after year. He, for the next few years, had to continue going back to these places where he had all these amazing memories with his friend Eddie. And so these memories continue to haunt him. He could never like fully escape the memories that he had with his friend. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because I want to tell you about something that WWE WWE made in 2000. They had a reality show called Tough Enough. So Tough Enough was just like any other competition reality show where people would come, they want to like compete to be on WWE, you know, get a contract. So they would like train you, and then they would have like matches or whatever, and then they would decide like who was going home at the end of the week, and then, you know, then you have a winner, just like any other competition reality show. This one just happened to be for wrestlers. There was this amateur wrestler. His name was Chris Nowinski. Chris Nowinski. I hope I get his name right. So Chris Nowinski, actually, he was a very intelligent man. He had graduated from Harvard. He had played on the Harvard football team. And that was like his character, was he was an annoying Harvard jock, and I hated him. He was very good at his character. Now, Chris didn't win Tough Enough. He was the runner-up. And a couple of years later, he actually did get into WWE for a year. Now, the reason I'm telling you about him is he actually decided he was going to retire in 2004 because he realized for an entire year he was suffering from post-concussion syndrome. He was experiencing dizziness, agitation, tiredness, fatigue, all the things that can come from long-term damage from having repeated concussions. I think he said that he could remember having 8 concussions, which that's a lot of concussions. I've had 2 in my whole life. So after his retirement, he dove into concussions, researching concussions, and specifically researching something called, I'm gonna have to read this, so it's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I'm gonna put it across the screen just so in case. Or it's called CTE. In 2004, there was like not a lot of information about CTE. A lot of people had never even heard of CTE before. And actually, it's still something that we are researching and learning a lot about to this day. Chris, because he played football and he did wrestling, you know, those are 2 really high impact sports. So he started working with researchers and developed the Sports Legacy Institute. They had known of 4 cases of documented CTE, and they had not ended well. Some had ended in suicide, and one ended in a very horrific death. Now, when you work at WWE, as long as you don't end on bad terms, like going over to another promotion or something like that, you're kind of always welcome backstage. You can come and hang out and see all the wrestlers. You're always considered family. He would go out and hang out backstage, talk to other wrestlers. It was kind of a little bit of research, even, really. He did recall a quick conversation that he had had with Chris Benoit. He kind of recalled this after the tragic events, and it was when Chris approached him, well, Benoit, rather, because they're both named Chris. Benoit approached Nowinski and said, hey, I've been hearing that you're doing some research on concussions and whatnot. You know, they started talking about concussions, how many concussions Chris Benoit had. He said he had no idea how many he'd had. Possible side effects. The conversation itself was really quick, but it ended with Benoit giving Nowinski his number and asking him to give him a call in the week. Nowinski said he did call, but when he called, it sounded like Benoit was kind of in the middle of an argument of some kind, and it wasn't a good time. Benoit asked if he could call him back, but Nowinski never received a follow-up call. In 2007, Nancy could see that wrestling was just not healthy for him. It wasn't healthy physically because he was destroying his body. And obviously it wasn't good for his mental health because he was dealing with still the loss of his friend, even though it was 2 years later. A lot of fighting was happening in the home. The paranoia was becoming more extreme. Nancy wanted him out. She wanted him to be home with her, possibly maybe taking on like a backstage role or something. On June 23rd, 2007, Chavo Guevara, Eddie's nephew, was, I think they were in Texas, because they had a big pay-per-view event. It was Vengeance. Usually before a pay-per-view event, those are on Sundays, and they'll have like house shows, which are wrestling events that are not televised to like local people. And I've been to a couple house shows. They're really fun. They get a little wilder and crazier because they're not on TV. They can like say more things and do more things and interact with fans a lot more. I like house shows. And they usually do house shows around the areas they're in to kind of get like people hyped up, or if you can't necessarily afford to go to the televised event, at least you can usually go to a house show. They're a lot cheaper. So they're on their way to the house show, and Chavo gets a voicemail from Chris Benoit, and it says, I've missed my flight. And that Nancy and their son Daniel were sick. So Chavo called him back, and Chris Benoit told him that Nancy and Daniel both had food poisoning. And he even later said to the WWE officials that called him they had food poisoning. They were puking up blood. He was going to be taking him to the hospital. So he said, look, they have food poisoning. I'm going to try and catch a later flight. And before he hung up with Chavo, he said, I love you. Chavo thought that was kind of weird. Not even that he said that I love you, just like the way he said it. So then Chavo called him back and said, hey man, are you okay? And Chris said, yeah, I'm fine. I'm just really stressed out. They came to the conclusion. They're like, hey, you know what? You're not going to make the house show because he missed his second flight. Just stay home, relax. You're stressed out. Make sure Nancy and Daniel are good and make sure that you're here for Vengeance tomorrow night. He was set to fight CM Punk for the ECW championship. I think I said that he got that voicemail on Friday, but he got it on a Saturday. So then Monday morning, it was like, I don't know. See, I've gotten conflicting things. Some places say it was like some interviews that Chavo gave say it was between like 3 and 4, and then some say it was like 4:30, 5 o'clock, but whatever. So between the hours of like 3 and 4:30 a.m., Chavo got a couple text messages from Chris Benoit. Now, the text messages were kind of weird. They were just saying like where the dogs were in the house. They were like, they'd put them, I think he said they put them in the pool house. And then he also sent over his physical address. Now, Chavo thought, well, that's kind of weird. Why did he send me that? But whatever, you know, he was going to be picking Chris up at the airport in a couple hours. They had a pay-per-view that night. It didn't matter. Then a couple minutes later, he got the same text messages from Nancy Benoit's phone and he still ignored them. So then he didn't hear from Chris the whole day. So the person they were traveling with was a referee named Scott Armstrong, who also used to be a wrestler as well. He got the same text messages. They thought it was kind of weird, but they were like, you know what? Chris is our friend. We're going to like cover for him, whatever. We're not going to like rat him out. But he never made the pay-per-view event. Now, the WWE had spoken to him and he said that he was taking his family to the hospital because they were sick, but then they never heard from him again. They repeatedly tried to call him. They actually called hospitals in the area he lived in too, and they couldn't find anything. And it was 11 p.m. that night that they stopped trying to get a hold of it. Because at this point, Vengeance has ended. Usually the pay-per-views end at like 11 o'clock, so it's over. It's done. The show is... So the next day, John Laureatis, who coincidentally is the Bella twins' stepdad, so he saw Chavo Guevara and he said, hey, have you heard from Chris at all? Finally, Chavo showed Joe these text messages that he got, and Laureatis was like, oh my God, why didn't you show us this before? He actually probably said it in a super deep raspy voice because he actually had his vocal cords broken during a wrestling match. And then by 12:45, the WWE officials had already called Fayetteville County Police, or I don't think they were county, I think they just called the police. And they reported that one of their talents had been missing. They hadn't heard from him in 24 hours and he did not show up to work, which was very unlike Chris, very much a professional. Now, a weird little thing about this is before the WWE knew technically what had been going on, before they called the police, this was updated at like 2 a.m. The Chris Benoit Wikipedia page was updated after the Vengeance event saying, quote, that Chris Benoit had skipped Vengeance due to the death of his wife. Now, at this point, this was not public knowledge. Nobody knew that Nancy Benoit had passed and nobody had found their bodies yet. So the fact that this update happened was kind of suspicious. It was confirmed after the WWE sent a welfare check to the Benoit home. 3 hours later, Fayetteville police called the WWE and they confirmed that in their welfare check they did find 3 bodies, one of a man, a woman, and a child, and it was considered a major crime scene. And that was the only information that they gave the WWE. So the WWE gathered all of their talent ringside on Monday before they would be going live for the regular Monday Night Raw show, and they told the talent that Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, and their son Daniel had all passed away. They had no information to give them, and it was very tragic. And I mean, obviously people were very upset about it, especially Vicky, because Nancy was one of her best friends. The Benoits were a second family to her, and then they were just all gone, and nobody knew why. So because the WWE had no information as to what happened, all they knew is that they lost somebody who was very beloved to their company. They announced on, I think it was an app. Did they have apps back then? But they definitely announced on their website that that Chris Benoit had passed away. So instead of their regular 3-hour Monday Night Raw, they were going to be airing a 3-hour tribute. They included a lot of highlights, some from like, he had like a special WWE DVD, interviews from him, and of course some other wrestlers came and paid their respects. not unlike what happened with Eddie Guerrero. Some wrestlers, however, said, you know what, I don't really want to do that because I don't really know what's happened yet, and I just didn't feel good about the situation. Unfortunately, as the segment started to air, more and more information about what happened in the Benoit home started to come out. By the third hour, it was revealed that there were no suspects in this, and police were assuming that this was a murder-homicide investigation. So then the next night on ECW, before it began to air, Vince McMahon actually made a public on-air statement. It was recorded beforehand that they had acted prematurely in their tribute to Chris Benoit, and they would not be talking about Chris Benoit on that night's episode of ECW. And then subsequently afterwards, it just became pretty much known that nobody was going to be talking about Chris Benoit ever again on any WWE platform. And from that moment on, he was pretty much erased from WWE history. You don't find him in games anymore. He's never in any promotional stuff. So what happened when police arrived to the home? So they thought they were just doing a basic welfare check. When they arrived, there was already a neighbor there. She was probably feeding the dogs because she said to police she hadn't seen anybody home in a while, and the dogs were there. So she fed them. They knew her pretty well. The police asked if she could put the two German Shepherds in a safe place so they could, make sure everybody was safe. She said, of course. She hopped the little gate and went into the side door that was left open. I'm assuming she probably took the dogs to Daniel's room, their son, because she ran out screaming Daniel's dead. So I think she's probably putting him in there and obviously did not expect to find Daniel or anybody in the home. That's when police escorted her off the scene and entered. The first bedroom they came into, they did find the body of Daniel. He was on his bed, and next to him was a Bible. They went through a couple more rooms, and then I'm assuming it was probably the master room. They found the body of Nancy Benoit. She was wrapped in some sort of fabric, and she also had a Bible next to her. So as police start to move through the home, they move down to the basement where Chris's gym was. When they entered the gym, they then found Chris Benoit. He had hung himself by using one of his weight machines. So what exactly happened in the house is not totally known, but based on decomposition of the bodies, they can kind of tell time frames that were happening. I will say that on June 22nd, a former tag team partner of Chris Benoit had passed away, and something that might have been a catalyst for maybe his break in his mental break. On June 22nd, which was a Friday, Nancy Benoit was killed. Nancy was actually strangled with a cord. Her hands and feet were bound, and there is evidence to suggest that while she was being strangled, Chris was putting his knee on her back to pull back more and give more leverage. So it was pretty aggressive. Then it isn't exactly known when Daniel passed, but rate of decomposition was that it had been at least a day. So his death is marked as Saturday, June 23rd of 2007. Now, toxicology showed that Daniel was actually given Xanax, so he was drugged, and being 7 at the time and the amount of Xanax that he had in his body, he was probably unconscious at the time of his death. Autopsies show or suggest that he was suffocated, which would also make sense because he was found in his bed as well. Nancy and Daniel both had Bibles placed next to them as well. So when people started jumping to, was this roid rage? Did he do this because of steroid abuse and then flipped out? A lot of psychologists said that placing Bibles next to their bodies kind of negates the whole roid rage thing because that's too much thought and remorse going into something like that. Now, it was a day before the police and everybody honed in on the Wikipedia post. Who did this? Where did this come from? So the IP address of the Wikipedia post stating that Chris Benoit had killed his wife came from Stamford, Connecticut, which is where the headquarters of WWE is. Now, a lot of people still think that either somebody at WWE did this or that Chris Benoit actually updated this post himself. Police honed in on some 19-year-old Wikipedia troll who had apparently been banned from editing other pages that had nothing to do do with anything. And he said it was just like a coincidence that he was in some kind of wrestling forum and people were saying like, oh, I bet Nancy's dead or something, and that's why Chris didn't show up for work. So apparently it was already a bit of a rumor, but nobody knew like where that rumor started. And he said it was a complete coincidence that he updated the Wikipedia page and then that was actually the truth. Police were like, you know what, he doesn't have anything to do with this, and they just kind of left it at that. But it's still pretty suspicious that on top of it being right, that the kid lives where WWE headquarters are. So I feel like he probably is related to somebody that's there or something like that. Like it's weird. It's weird. So like I said, the media, everybody liked to jump on this whole roid rage thing, and it did actually end up becoming like a Senate hearing on the use of steroids and performance enhancing drugs within the WWE and other sports. And I think even like Vince McMahon did testify before like the Senate based on stuff with this. But it was determined through toxicology, it didn't actually have a lot of steroids in his system or testosterone. In fact, it looked like he'd actually been on a regulated testosterone therapy to maybe even get over his use of testosterone earlier in his career. Now, Chris Nowinski, remember that guy from Tough Enough who retired because of concussions? He heard about what happened to Chris and his family, and he immediately remembered the conversation that he had had. Now, he said this conversation only happened a few months before the tragedy that happened. So he immediately called Chris Benoit's father and he asked him, can I study his brain? And he probably was very skeptical, but once he got talking to Nowinski more, he agreed. And it was determined that Chris had very serious brain trauma. I've seen images of Chris Benoit's brain next to a normal healthy brain. And I mean, I don't really know what a brain is supposed to actually look like, but I don't think it's supposed to look like that. They said flat out, this looks like the brain of an 85-year-old dementia patient. It explained a lot of the paranoia, the aggressive behavior he was experiencing at home. Of course, he was gone, so there was no way to test and get all of the information, everything he was experiencing. But I tend to think he was probably suffering from CTE, and a lot of other people think the same thing. And Chris was only 40 years old. So they were all cremated. Nancy and Daniel had a private ceremony in Daytona Beach, Florida, and their ashes were kept with Nancy's family. And then Chris Benoit was also cremated, and there was a private ceremony in, I believe, Alberta. Where his ashes are is unknown. It's a private location. They may have been scattered. I don't know. So that kind of wraps up the Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit suicide murder. This was a really hard story. You can see I get emotional in a couple of parts because I saw the pain and the confusion that Chris dealt with the loss of his friends. It's just hard to see somebody who was so on top of their game, and somebody who, though obviously you may not think it from this tragic events, he did love his family, and he was obviously going through something so horrible his brain couldn't comprehend it. I don't know if he fully understood everything that he had done until it was too late, and that was why he took his own life. It was also stated that he did put a Bible next to Daniel and Nancy, but there was no Bible next to him. I don't think he felt like he deserved that. Oddly enough, the other thing is that Eddie Guerrero was the one that got Chris into religion and got him his first Bible. It's just a really hard story. It's really tragic. It also left a stain on WWE and the sports community and the wrestling community kind of as a whole. Because I mean, on one hand, Chris Benoit is considered one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. So many people say if it wasn't for the tragic events that we're talking about, he would be within their top 3 wrestlers. But on the other hand, you have such tragic events that they completely overshadow and overtake any accomplishments that he built in his entire wrestling career. And you know what? To be honest, that's fine. WWE hasn't publicly stated this, I don't think, but it is well known that Chris Benoit is never going to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. The company's never going to overlook his actions. Now, I think Nancy Benoit should definitely be in the WWE. Like, woman did so much for just like the overall idea of a valet. And WWE does own WCW, so they could totally do that and get away with it and not have to worry about licensing. They already own it. It's fine. I think the problem for that also comes with there is still such a like heavy connection with Chris. It would be difficult for the company. Now, some people don't agree with that. They think like, hey, you know what? Chris Benoit, sure, he did some horrible things, but he was a great wrestler and he deserves a spot in the WWE. I personally, I don't know if I subscribe to that. And I actually saw this amazing clip that somebody asked John Cena, of all people. I feel like you know who John Cena is. They asked him how he feels about Chris Benoit not getting into the Hall of Fame, because actually John Cena did wrestle Chris Benoit. And I'm gonna read this. This is a direct quote. Oftentimes we get caught up in a person's ability, and this transcends WWE. This is a problem with sports and entertainment. People will do bad things, but if we're good enough at what we do, sometimes those things are overlooked. I don't believe in that. I believe you should take ownership of your actions, all of them, not just the ones in front of the audience. I feel like a lot of influencers and celebrities could take that advice. And then he does say that, you know, the WWE is kind of setting a precedent for other sports organizations and other entertainment that we have to hold people accountable. And, you know, I think I agree with him. I agree with John Cena. Just because people who are good at what they do bad things doesn't mean we can overlook the bad things that they do just because they have some sort of natural talent and ability that we identify with. It's just a lesson that time and time again we need to remember to learn. And with that is our video for today. This was a heavy one for me, for you guys, I'm sure. I bet if you're my age, you remember this story. It was very big. There were a lot of really bad jokes made about it when we were kids. And WWE does still have on their network, they do have events that have Chris Benoit in it. They didn't totally cut him out, but they do always have like a warning that like Chris Benoit is going to be included in this. And they do try and like cut his promos out. If there's any kind of people like talking about him and like commentary, they like cut that out. He's more or less essentially been erased from WWE. It's kind of crazy. So thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Don't forget to check out my live streams if you're interested and you want to chat with me. I'm awkward. Bye, guys.